Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are around the world. Thanks for joining today's webinar from Real Story Group. Certainly an interesting topic for us as a company that is formerly known as CMS Watch, as we're going to be talking about the death of web content management systems, well, at least the death as we know it. So our founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, will dive into this topic, and should be an interesting one for you today. So thanks for taking some time out of your day to join us for this 30-minute presentation. We're going to have some time at the end for questions. So if you have questions or anecdotes you'd like to share, you can enter those into the questions tab and the GoToWebinar control panel. And as always, you will get a copy of these slides from our marketing team within the next couple of days. So keep an eye out for that. And for our subscribers on the line, this will be available in your subscriber library later this week. So stay tuned for that. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony to get us going today. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. This is kind of a bittersweet topic for me. I was the original founder of CMS Watch, which was our previous name of Real Story Group, and founded the company CMS Watch as a different kind of analyst and advisory firm, really in reaction to these quadrants that analyst firms were putting out at the time, particularly these quadrants about CMS vendors. That I was working at a firm where we were implementing CMS tools, and there was this incredible gulf between what analysts and consultants were saying about these tools and our lived experience actually implementing these tools. And I was like, there's got to be a better way to tell the real story about how these systems really work and what are the deep gotchas and what's actually going on among these different vendors. So founded CMS Watch really as kind of an alternative to traditional analyst firms. We grew over time, started analyzing and evaluating other types of marketing technology and digital vendors and marketplaces. This map we've been putting out for 18 years now. In a couple of weeks, you'll see a webinar about the new 2026 version, which we're super excited about. Going to be some new subway lines coming to this map. Today, nominally, we're going to talk about the oldest line on this map, which is the light blue line, the Web Content and Experience Management line, and how it's really going to change and contract. And we're going to brush briefly against the red line, which is omni-channel content platforms, which is really kind of a spin-off from the digital asset management or DAM space. But the point is that as a MarTech leader, an enterprise MarTech leader, we know that you have a lot of choices. And our mission in life is to help you, the MarTech leader, make really good choices. And you have, I think, when it comes to web content management, whether you call it Web CMS, WCM, WCXM, I think we all know what we're talking about here. You have some really profound choices in front of you right now. And we think that 2030 is going to look very different from 2025 and even 2026. And it's really time to be rethinking what's the role of this technology in what we believe is likely to be a fairly rapidly evolving stack. So with that, let's get into it. I'm going to do a really short history tour because I think where we've been is kind of, I would say, holding us back maybe a little bit from some of the changes that we need to make going forward. But then we're going to talk about a new stack model, a model that's really prepping you for the 2030s, where customer experience in particular is going to be very different than it is today. And then we're going to ask really the question, I think it's the basic question that we're going to be asking over the next couple of years is, do you even need a web CMS at all? And if so, what's the alternative and what do you do? So this is going to be a pretty fast-paced half hour. Once again, as Scott mentioned, you can always post questions, disagreements, comments, whatever, in the questions tab, and we'll have some time at the end to cover that. Okay, well, as an analyst firm who's advising, digital leaders, you should expect some sort of a reference model. And so this was the first reference model that we built in the early 2000s. It basically had your CMS at the center of your digital world, and you had all this different kind of source content going into it, and then end user content, including, highly elaborated PDF files, what constituted wireless devices back then, of course, web pages, some of them structured web pages, and then syndication. Syndication was always a big deal, and what's interesting is it's coming back as a super big deal right now, where a lot of your experiences are going to happen in other walled gardens. And so there's some lingering value to this reference model, but it really only lasted a decade, because in the 2010s already we had really a reference model for the multi-channel world. And so the idea was all these new channels, digital channels are popping up. We have the rise, of course, of mobile phones, social, email, much more digital video. And so how do you deal with that? Well, the idea was, well, you beef up in all these engagement environments with a DAM over on the left that might feed your web content management, that might feed your marketing automation platform for outbound marketing, and then of course social engagement. And the idea was then all these would feed all these different channels, right? And so what happened in the 2010s is, for better or worse, we ended up kind of bulking up at the edge here, at the actual engagement layer, and then trying to integrate these platforms for a more coherent customer interaction as all these different new channels kept coming online. And that was great in a lot of ways, and we certainly invested and modernized, and you built teams and whole departments around these things. The problem was really twofold. One is that these became silos, and in many cases not just technology silos, but also operational silos. And that wasn't working as the number of channels, got greater and greater and greater. And that's still an issue today for nearly all the enterprises we work with. The second problem was these were never meant to be integration platforms. And even today, they're not really very good integration platforms. I mean, try to, integrate with like a WordPress, or for that matter, Salesforce, Sales Cloud. Integrating with your email marketing platform from a data standpoint can be a nightmare. So, they weren't designed to be integration platforms. And so we have all this horizontal spaghetti integration that's going on that's just kind of barely holding our stack together. And so that model really got exposed in the omni-channel world, and in particular during the pandemic. And so the vendor response to this was really interesting. So what you had was major CMS vendors saying, well, we'll acquire all these things. We'll acquire a DAM, we'll acquire an e-commerce platform, we'll acquire an email marketing vendor, we'll acquire some personalization services, we'll acquire some social publishing and social listening services. And these analyst firms will make up this new kind of three-letter acronym for us called DXP. And the thing is about DXPs, or digital experience platforms, they never actually really existed. They originally was designed to sort of help portal vendors say that they weren't portal vendors anymore. And so it was always a dumb idea. It's still a dumb idea. Just because your vendor has acquired some e-commerce platforms or some email marketing platforms doesn't mean that they're the right match for you. And of course, they never really integrated them very well. And of course, that whole model is falling apart. And of course, analyst firms got this really wrong. I mean, you look at this only 6-7 years ago, you had a bunch of tools in the upper right that today don't even live on this chart anymore, or way down in the lower left. So you basically can't trust Forrester and Gartner on this landscape. The reaction of the CMS market was to say, okay, we need to modernize, and the way we're going to modernize is by all these new headless platforms, right? And headless really was more of trying to solve a technical problem. It wasn't really solving a marketer or a digital experience problem. It basically was, we don't want the CMS delivering our whole front-end experience, which makes sense, right? We live in a multi-channel world at some level. On the other hand, pure headless didn't really solve for all the different use cases. It was really more of a feature and not really a game changer. And so it was a kind of a modernization, but only across a couple of different use cases. And I think we learned that the hybrid model ultimately won out, where you could be both headless as well as coupled, and that way solve all of your different use cases with one CMS instead of two. So headless ended up being, in fact, a kind of a dark alley, because for a number of firms, it kind of sent us back to this really developer-centric world that I think we've all been trying to get out of. And in the meantime, the WCM marketplace has really evolved. I mean, the market is highly fragmented, but it's squeezing towards the middle. So you've got from the right hand, as you're looking at the screen, site builders like Wix and Squarespace and others pushing hard from the low end. At the very top of the market, it's been pretty dismal. I mean, there's really only one toolkit vendor left. That's Adobe. There's a really open question that's been asked for the last 10 years or so. Do we even need a toolkit? And the answer is 99% of the time, you do not. So you have these upper range and mid-range platforms, which have varying degrees of customizability and extensibility versus, the necessary complexity and developer intensivity and cost that kind of come with that. We would argue that most of the vendors remaining here are what we call Web 3.0 vendors, which means that they are kind of omnibus platforms. And that's a place, honestly, where you really don't want to be. So this is a traditional view of the web content management marketplace from a complexity spectrum. So that's what a good way to look at mature markets is on a kind of complexity spectrum. Complexity spectrum isn't making a value judgment. It's just sort of saying you can spend a lot more to get a certain degree of customizability. You can spend a lot less in terms of total cost of ownership and complexity to get something a little bit more out of the box, right? And then there's all this in between. So we're not making a value judgment, but rather that the market has become, you know, somewhat compressed to this middle kind of consensus around what a WCM should do or not do. And I think part of that consensus is that it should be hybrid headless rather than pure headless or pure non-headless. So that's kind of where we're at. This is where the CMS market, we're just looking at the CMS market, that's how it's evolved. But the thing is that it's evolving towards a future that I don't think large enterprises need or are going to want. It's a different story in the mid-market and small business market, which we'll talk about. But for the enterprise market, you're really facing a set of new stack challenges and consideration that change all the equations. So this is the digital reference architecture we're using for the 2020s. Early next year, we're going to be putting out a 2030 North Star. In other words, a projection of what your stack should look at in 2030 and how do you get there as a MarTech leader. But what we're really looking at here is a set of engagement channels which have expanded dramatically and are going to continue to expand, right? And then you have a set of engagement services, which is where historically we've invested very heavily. And then you have customer foundation services. We think the real growth area is in these customer foundation services. That's where you ought to be doing your AI investments. So you've got 3 different legs to this stool. So you've got content and information with generative AI, you've got data with insights AI, a lot of us have been working on that, and then decisioning as decisioning AI. Now the key thing about these customer foundation services is they are decoupled from your engagement services, right? In other words, instead of having all this content and data and decisioning jammed into your loyalty platform, jammed into your marketing platform, jammed into your WCXM, jammed into your e-commerce, you abstract those out so they can be used and improved by AI then across all these new channels, including things, for example, like AEO, which kind of came up out of nowhere and now is really, really important. There's going to be a lot of other stuff like that coming up. So we think that this trend has already happened, that we're watching and advising smart enterprises who are getting there. This is going to be the challenge for most of you over the next decade is to get there. And this definitely requires some investment lower in your stack. We sometimes call this Pilates for your stack. But the good news is, this is really exciting news, is that you can get much later at the engagement tier because those capabilities that you see in this first middle row of colored boxes, they no longer need to be decision makers. They're more order takers. They're getting all the key data, the key content, and the key decision logic from somewhere else. All you have to do is just create an experience within that channel. So you don't need a big channel team for one thing, and you don't need heavyweight technology for another thing. We're already seeing this now with loyalty. We're seeing this with outbound marketing. We're definitely seeing it with e-commerce. And so, of course, for a long time, we talked about Headless, which was basically separating engagement services from engagement channels, right? And separating the first layer at the top from the second layer. Now we have this concept of legless, that what you want for your engagement services is that they can ingest all the key stuff, the data, the content, and the decisions from somewhere lower in your stack so your customers can have a more coherent message. And this is the only way that you can scale and be effective in the AI era. This is the only way. But it's really a good news story for you, the enterprise MarTech customer, because you can shift your resources to much more higher value activities and stop wasting all this time with these multi-million-dollar web content management platforms and multi-million-dollar outbound marketing platforms. So there's an opportunity here, first of all, at a minimum, to get simpler at the engagement tier. And I think Sitecore, the demise of the demise of Sitecore's flagship XP platform is really a canary in the coal mine. All 5 of those vendors that we see out there are way, way, way too heavyweight for what you are likely to need going forward. We're recommending really thinking hard about simpler platforms that do a better job of playing well with others. Now, that's kind of a short-term view, maybe carry you over for the next 5-6 years. A lot of you are already kind of leaning that way, which is great. If you want to go in that direction, please consult with us. We can help you get there. We've helped some large enterprises get there, and it's been super exciting. But what I'm going to ask you right now is even a more deeper question, which is, do you need these tools at all? In the long run, you probably not, at least not the way that they're conceived today. And so the question is, of course, how long is that long run? And it's a good question, but it needs to be asked. Do you even need a Web CMS at all? So let's look at the evolution here, and I think where we're going is once again, where we've been is once again kind of telling us where we're going. So we've got kind of 4 phases of this. One, WCM 1.0 was a simple page publisher. And you can read all this, mostly static pages, responsive mobile web design, basic A/B testing. Many large media companies still subsist under this model. So we're not making a value judgment here that this is like old school. In fact, most of you still have this set of use cases, and that's great, that's fine, it's important. But we did evolve beyond that for many of you where you needed more of a content catalog. So this was really where Drupal kind of excelled, and then a whole set of other sort of more database-oriented CMS platforms that you could have this placeless content that would be assembled and delivered dynamically based on metadata. This is where we first started seeing headless and more importantly, hybrid headless architectures, adaptive mobile design. This lends itself, and typically more sophisticated governance models. So that was nice, but then we saw both enterprises and vendors with great ambitions really going to what we call WCM 3.0, which is turning your Web CMS platform into a customizable application. And so the good news is, well, this allowed you to integrate to some extent with other MarTech platforms, although that has turned out to be very difficult for most of you. It allows for the injection of Gen AI and more advanced analytics. You do need to have very sophisticated SDLC processes for updates and enhancements. In other words, changes to your website often become software development projects. This was useful in the 2010s. It's a total dead end for the 2020s. You need to get out of this mode. It is way too heavyweight. You do no longer want your website to be this complicated, multidimensional, customizable application. So we have this notion of WCM 4.0, which is interesting because there isn't necessarily a lot of content that's being stored natively here at all. We call it an inbound experience manager, where your web front end is really just an aggregation of different content and services from across your enterprise, assembled dynamically into different experiences. Some may be more application heavy, some are going to be more content heavy. A lot of them are going to be mixes of services and content, both pre-login and post-login. And the important thing here is that key content data personalization logic relies in lower level channel neutral platforms. And that way you can be coherent across all your customer journeys. And this is the only way to scale. And if you're thinking ahead here, some of you are already having in the back of my mind, agents, and that's likely where this is going to go. It's going to take a little bit more time maybe than some of us might want, but ultimately you're going to have a lot of AI logic and ultimately agentic support in terms of how are we assembling these experiences, these inbound experiences, and how are they going to differ based on all of the other types of experiences that I might be having across a multitude of different channels with my customers and prospects. So the key insight here as well is that your web content is not a superset of your enterprise engagement content. It never was. And so you shouldn't treat it that way. You should not treat it as the center of your digital content universe, because then you're shoving it into a channel, and that's like going back to jail. The point is to get out of jail and to free up your content, and the way to do that is to manage your content at a much lower level. I would say your important enterprise content. So we'll get to that in a second. So if we look at this sort of rethinking your requirements, there's definitely a set of vendors that go along with this at each level. Page publisher, content catalog, customizable application. Most of these are going to be dead ends for you. It's just a question of when. They're going to be too heavy, too expensive, and completely out of sync with what's happening. And by the way, another wake-up call should have been the dramatic drop in traffic that we're all seeing from search engines, and a substantial, although still potentially small, stream of new engagement that's happening through LLMs and chat. And that ought to tell us that this world of the heavyweight website is where we are grossly, overspending. So this is why we say, look, with the possible exception of Page Publisher, websites that were built as these complex catalogs or web CMSs where it's serving as a complex catalog or a complex customizable application, you are not going to need those anymore. You're not going to want those anymore. It's just a question of when. So what's the alternative? There's a lot of tectonic forces going on here. I think, new channels, the need for customer experience cohesion, in-product experience becoming important, rampant distribution requirements. So you're needing to send your content all over the place, including to a number of walled gardens. All these intense external forces happening that you see on the right. And then, of course, all of you live in a world where these 6 demands at the bottom are just getting more and more intense. So the only way to deal with this is scalability and automation and having a foundational set of truly enterprise engagement content, and your web content management your content management system is too far forward and can't support those needs. So as we see complexity, people, and budget moving south in your stack, this is the only way to get to speed and scale, the only way to omnichannel. And by the way, this is the only way to get effective AI. AI wants you to have the kind of core corpus of customer data, content, and business rules that it can use as context. So the alternative, we think, really is in the rise of what we call omni-channel content platforms, or OCPs. We didn't like making up this term. We made this term up, omni-channel content platforms, but it was the only way that we could really define what we were seeing was a rise in this spin-off from the digital asset management marketplace, which was a different type of content agnostic way to organize content, particularly according to a graph model, where the intent of that was not necessarily to build a web page, but to have a set of related content components. Many of them were digital assets, and that's why this came out of the DAM space, that we could assemble and build into compound assets, and that we could use metadata around, and that we could derive different child assets from that we might use in different places. So channel still matters. Your TikTok video might be different than a YouTube video, which might be different than an Instagram story, but you're going to need to base it off some core content and relationships and then build those derivatives. And we think that the omnichannel content platform is the way this is going to happen in the future across all of your content. And this is where you're going to want to really invoke generative AI to place the guardrails around it, to provide the essential context to it. Gen AI really wants you to do this, wanted you to do this 10 years ago. Now you're going to really have to kind of catch up here. So this is really the model. We have this omni-channel content platform that has omni-channel content services, traditional DAM, product information. You've got generative AI feeding in, unified translation, whether it's AI or not. What was your web content management system is really now your inbound experiences, where you're doing potentially some page curation, potentially some dynamic experience assembly, maybe managing long-form one-off content, web-only content, but there's going to be less and less of that. So even long-form content, you're probably going to want to put in the OCP. So that's where your important content, your channel-independent content, your AI-focused content, that's where it's going to live. And that's going to require bulking up and changing some of your governance. And there's a lot of issues related to this. We know that this transition is hard, although we've helped some organizations make it, and it's been fascinating looking at the results. But the way you save then is by downshifting your investment in your team, in your website in general, and your web CMS specifically, right? That you repurpose those people, that money, and those resources to something more foundational, something of higher value to your enterprise. We think this is the future vision. Of course, AI is a big piece of this, and you're going to want to, of course, invoke responsible AI. So again, having a single AI layer is going to be really important to that, as opposed to lighting up generative AI just in your web channel. That just creates more siloed AI. Your web CMS vendors are siloing your AI by generating it in your web channel when you have all these other channels, like it or not, where your customers are interacting with you. So you really want to be able to do AI as a layer against a more omni-channel enterprise corpus. That's the first thing. Second thing is, of course, these foundational platforms, AI really wants and needs those. The third thing is to remember that there's 3 different types of AI, and we evaluate AI vendors in our own research against these use cases. But also, we think that agent AI is going to likely, the way that this flows are going to work is agent AI is going to trigger insights AI, which is then going to tell decisioning, is just going to say, okay, what did we learn and know? Now decisioning is going to say, what do we need to do about that? And then generative AI is going to be downstream from that. So this is really important. There's a flywheel here where agentic is going to manage something that's probably going to start with insights, then go to decisioning, and only then are you going to generate. So if you're generating content just on its own sake without any kind of intelligence behind it, then you're wasting your time with generative AI. Generative AI should be intelligent and driven by other forms of AI. And then finally, agentic itself is super interesting. We know we've done benchmarks with clients that without this kind of omni-channel content store of some kind that's providing context, your generative AI is really going to suck. So if you've got questions about agentic and what that all means in the context of content management, please feel free to reach out for us. We've learned some really interesting lessons there. Okay. What I've been talking about is really a large enterprise model. And what constitutes a large enterprise versus mid-market is a really interesting question. We just did a webinar about that a couple of weeks ago. You can, if you're a Real Story Group subscriber, you can, or corporate member, you can look that up and take a look at it. Definitely, there's a lot of upper mid-market companies that really should follow this kind of composable model, but there's also a whole raft of truly mid-market companies who probably are not going to have this kind of composed enterprise architecture. And so we do think there's still a place for the what we call kind of CMS plus vendors in the mid-market, where they have all these bundled inbound services. So definitely Progress, WordPress, Qualify, got a variety of services that you might want to be exposed differently in a more composed enterprise. But at the mid-market, you know, we see potentially having these kind of CMS plus CMS in a box vendors, along with potentially customer engagement platforms. So kind of putting those two together, and that's your stack in a box. So I just wanted to put that little asterisk or caveat that this whole discussion that I've been having about basically the death of Web CMS is really related to kind of initially, at least, a large enterprise composable model. Whereas in the mid-market, I think we'll see what we call these CMS plus vendors, these website in a box and web application platforms in a box still persist for some time into the 2030s. And that is kind of a useful thing, particularly if you marry it up with a mid-market customer engagement platform. I've been mentioning these marketplaces, these vendors. We've got the inside scoop on them if you're interested. We evaluate all of them. And so feel free to ping me later if you're wondering about one vendor versus another. So some final thoughts. The scope of WCM is already dramatically narrowing at the enterprise tier. And so that's reducing its relative importance in your overall stack, but also in some cases, reducing its absolute importance in your overall stack, and you should be downshifting accordingly. The long-term future here is really around for your inbound experiences, whether those are mobile apps, mobile web, website, web applications that are content fueled, is really, the issue here is really going to be more around assembly, and that the essential data and content and decisioning is going to come from somewhere else. And your existing WCM has to play more nicely in that stack than ever, or simply go away. And so there's, you know, for those who have been in the industry for a long time, this is kind of a bittersweet moment. I'm going to focus on the sweet part here with number 3, which is this is an opportunity for you to simplify or kill your WCM investments. And that in the long run is going to be good for you as a professional and good for your enterprise as well. But again, that final caveat number 4 is that the SMB and mid-market story we will probably see more continuity. You'll see these like site-in-a-box CMS with a stack-in-a-box CEP kind of working together. That will persist a little bit going forward, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So, so conclusions: DXP always was a dead end, still is, especially a good time to reconsider your dev-heavy CMS. And then finally, headless is not a panacea for this. And headless CMS still kind of puts everything into your web channel at a time when your web channel is about to become one of your least important channels. Hate to say that, but it's true. So with that, I know this has been somewhat provocative. Certainly welcome pushback, questions, anything that you'd like to suggest relative to your own experience in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar control panel. And in the meantime, Scott, you can just talk about how folks can stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to have this type of insights available to you, you can always leverage our research and advisory services by becoming a Real Story Group corporate member. So feel free to email us at the coordinates there. We can talk more about that, and you can get Tony as a resource for your team, along with the rest of our expert analysts here. Speaking of which, we will be having another webinar from Tony and the rest of the team in 2 weeks. So December 10th, we're going to take a look at that 2026 vendor map that Tony alluded to. And so please join us at that to wrap up the calendar year. And again, feel free to reach out with any questions, many of which I do see here in the questions tab, Tony.
So Alexander is asking a really long question here. Currently, we are viewing it from the perspective of institutions want to share with consumers who are limited to reading prepared. However, consumers are now leaving, allowing AI to consume and transform. That's totally true. There's going to be new intermediaries, and that's why you need to get content out of your web channel. In the future, they will need a tool to do so. So all tools, including only help create and publish. However, the consumer today we have a second field besides extranets and intranets. These will need the more platform-based. Yeah, I mean, I think if you're talking, Alexander, about the profusion of channels and the profusion of ways that we're going to have humans and agents and then these hybrid human agents, if you're referring to this incredible profusion of things, intranets, extranets still enduring, I agree 100%. It's, in fact, this total profusion of things is why we need to rethink content at a much more fundamental level. Eric is asking, no Magnolia on the slide, where are the Swiss? Yeah, Magnolia is in there. I mean, you know, there's several vendors who aren't on that slide whose future is really interesting to think about and talk about. I think we can take that one offline. Peter's asking, wasn't OCP the original vision of pure headless CMSs such as content.ai? No. Headless CMSs were just a different way of doing your web channel. They were mostly text-based with images as an afterthought, typically didn't have graph models, didn't handle compound assets, didn't track parent-child relationships the same way, and we don't know a single headless CMS vendor that really qualifies as an OCP. We know at least 4 or 5, maybe 6 dams that do. Let's see, let's keep going here. Sarah is asking, what do you mean advanced features get externalized? Yeah, sorry, that was really kind of analyst speak, wasn't it? When in the final slide we said advanced features will get externalized, what that means is that things like personalization, next best action, behavioral based modifications, those sort of things, digital asset management, all of that, it's going to come from some other place than your CMS, right? And this is already happening. It's going to happen even more, even where the base content comes from somewhere else. Kara is asking, do you have any examples you can share of organizations that have started down the path? Yes. So great question. We're working with several organizations on this. I know one in particular is a large global hospitality chain where they are getting rid of a WCM investment that was reaching up towards 8 figures a year, was insane. And they are converting everything, all their content to an OCP. It's a 2-year journey, and they're having a more composed front end where they can mix and match all sorts of structured and unstructured content along with services that you would expect a hospitality firm to be able to provide digitally. Super exciting. We're seeing other companies kind of leaning in that direction as well. It's a huge change, Carrie, I'm sure, as you can imagine, from a content perspective, from a organizational perspective. So I'm not saying this is easy, but I am saying you're gonna have to go there, particularly in an AI and agentic world. But the win is that you can subtract some of the resources and people from your experience layer. What do you see happening to Adobe given their bloat of futures? Yeah, that's a great question, Denise. What I think happening to Adobe is that they're going to keep bullshitting everybody about how they actually are moving in this direction, even though they really aren't. They're going to hang on to the incredible profitable platforms that they have at the edge. It's been very difficult for them to really put their CDP at the center of this universe. They do not have an OCP. I think that they're going to become a legacy vendor over the next decade. But they're very good marketers, they're very good bullshitters, and so they will probably delay their demise. Marcus is saying, CMS has always been an abstract content platform for which the website was only one to many. So he's saying, he's making a case for sanity. Sanity is interesting. Definitely, I think there's a lot of open questions, Marcus, around how much and to what extent and how will it work with the this WCM 4.0, where it's basically just experience assembly. And so vendors like Sanity do have a place in that. I think that's a longer conversation to have next year that we'll probably dive into a little bit more. Right now, we're a little bit more focused on sort of helping shake you out of your heavyweight web CMS slumber. And then what's the next step, Marcus, is a really interesting conversation that we're having here. Rich is asking, can you clarify how graph models will be integrated with WCM OCP? So OCP, by definition, at least our definition, has a graph model for information. And so that's really critical because you're going to need to, in the future, be able to relate products, customers, segments, content, assets, channel contextualization, parent-child within compound assets, parent-child within derivations, and so I'm mixing a number of different information science things there, but graph model will be really important to that. The thing about graphs, as you probably know, is that they can be kind of slow, and so at least when you're working with them, and so they'll probably be there's in the models that we've been helping enterprises put together, there's an intermediary layer between that and runtime. Carrie's asking, what is an OCP? An OCP, Carrie, unfortunately, is a term we had to make up, which was omni-channel content platform. We had to make it up because no one else was talking about it. It is a spin-off from the digital asset management, or DAM, world. This sounds a little bit, Jeff is making a really good critique here. This sounds a little bit like the promise made long ago for data lakes. Throw it all in one place and mine it for customer insights. Now AI will do the mining and the lake will include the UX. Actually, I don't think so, Jeff. I think more the concept of an OCP is not going to be a data lake. It's probably closer to a content warehouse, actually. It'll be highly structured. It'll be carefully curated. It'll do a lot of tracking and reporting is going to happen. And then the AI application will live above that, as opposed to let's just throw all our content in and let AI sort it out. That will not work, for sure. So you're making a really good point, Jeff, that we have to have a deeper conversation of what actually happens in an OCP. And for sure, it is not a content lake. It's probably closer to a highly curated content warehouse. Okay. That takes us well past the half hour. Thanks for those of you who stuck around. As Scott mentioned, you'll get a copy of the deck, and always welcome any kind of follow-up you'd like around this topic. We're going to be talking about this even more next year. We're in the process of working with several large enterprises on this journey. The journey goes far beyond content, but content, as you know, is one of the three legs of this. And it's probably, after data, the second most important leg. And so we're having some really interesting conversations and working through some really interesting architectural patterns around how to get here, and governance patterns as well with some of our corporate members. So if you want to get on that train, feel free to follow up with us. Otherwise, best wishes for those of you on the call. Typically that's half of you who will be celebrating an important holiday this weekend. And for the rest of you, I wish you a great rest of your month. And perhaps we'll see each other again in December. For the great team that we have here at Real Story Group, I'm going to sign off on their behalf. This is Tony Byrne. See you next time. So long.